Thank you, Faiza, for the kind introduction, and thank you to both you, Justin, and Chris, for inviting me to share, a little bit about the book. I'm very honored to be here. I just wish that I can be with you all in person in Singapore, but I guess this is good enough. All right. Let's see. Now, this talk is based on my book, What is Religious Authority? Cultivating Islamic Communities in Indonesia, that just came out in late June of this year. The book traces the history and contemporary labor of Ba'alawi saints and scholars in cultivating Islamic communities in Hadramaut, Yemen, and Java, Indonesia. The term Ba'alawi refers to the Sayyids, or descendants of the Prophet of Hadramaut, who for long have migrated to different parts of the Indian Ocean world, including the Swahili coast of East Africa, the Malabar coast of India, and of course, Southeast Asia. These mobile actors traverse complex cultural fields and build channels for the transmission and social realization of Islamic normative teachings. The central question that has driven my work is really on the title. I mean, what is Islamic religious authority? I mean, how does an actor become recognized by others as religiously authoritative to the extent that they can cultivate moral communities, and how is this recognition maintained? Now, instead of telling you the story that is in the book, what I want to do in this talk is to highlight the conceptual argument I am making, while situating it in relation to recent developments in both history and anthropology of Islam. And I want to do this in a way that speaks to the theme of this seminar series, that of religion, society, and trust. Of course, my hope is that by stating some of the book's theoretical and methodological interventions, you will perhaps find time to read the book and delve into the stories and ethnographies recounted in the book. So I'm not going to go to into the specifics, but instead I will try to flesh out some of the larger points that hopefully would be of interest to those of you who are studying the intersection between different religion, society, and trust. Okay, so let me begin with Tarikh Hadramaut as-Siyasi, or the political history of Hadramaut, written by a Java-born Hadrami modernist ideologue Salah al-Bakri and published in Cairo in 1936. In this ideologically driven history, al-Bakri criticized the state of religiosity in his ancestral homeland, the Hadramaut Valley of Yemen. At the center of his critique is the Ba'alawis, the descendants of the Prophet Muhammad, or Sayyids, who have lived in the Hadramaut since the 10th century. Al-Bakri faulted Ba'alawis for establishing what he described as Sulta Ruhiyya, spiritual authority or spiritual power. I think the term Sulta can either mean power or authority. So the Ba'alawis are faulted for establishing the Sulta Ruhiyya among the indigenous tribes of Hadramaut. In al-Bakri's view, this authority was created not through force or military might, but through showcasing piety and claiming descent from the Prophet. Each Ba'alawi family, al-Bakri explained, exercise authority over a particular Hadramit tribe, like the Al-Sheikh Abi Bakr over the Yafi'is, the Al-Aidarus over the Kathiris, and the Al-Atas over the Ja'da. This spiritual authority was instantiated in everyday practices, including in the special seating arrangements reserved for the Ba'alawis in rituals and gatherings, and the prescribed acts of kissing their hands. Now, despite its polemical nature, al-Bakri's two-volume history illustrates an important point that I want to focus on and think about in this talk. Namely, that Ba'alawi migration into tribal territories and their proselytizing activity among the tribes have generated multiple Islamic communities which revolve around different authoritative figures. Each tribe adhered to the religious norms only as articulated by figures or families whose religious authority it recognized and trusted. These authoritative figures embodied and instituted particular versions of Islamic norms that were born out of pragmatic negotiations with their followers and were subsequently institutionalized and maintained by their hereditary successors. What al-Bakri points to and deemed problematic was this development of multiple Islamic communities that revolved around divergent religious norms. He characterized Islamic norms that were realized in such communities as adulterated by bid'ah, or erroneous innovations introduced by the Ba'alawis, and are tainted by tribal customs and local cultures. Central to al-Bakri's outlook is a universalist vision of Islam that posits the existence of localized Islamic communities with divergent norms as a problem to be surmounted. Lurking behind his discourse is a conception of objectified Islam as an ideological force that can and ought to unite Muslims by transcending cultural, historical, and even class differences. Such an outlook is often attributed to the proponents of Islamic modernism, a term used to describe a variety of intellectual movements that emerged toward the end of the 19th century and sought to reconcile Islam, posited to have an objective existence separate from its socio-cultural realizations, with modern values. Consequently, modernist Muslims like al-Bakri tend to imagine culture as extraneous to Islam. Indeed, culture is often dismissed as an impediment to the social realization of a genuine Islam, one that is nevertheless imagined to be harmonious with the purportedly neutral modernity. Now, I want to compare this modernist vision with another vision of Islam, one that, unlike al-Bakri, stresses the imperative for religious norms to be modulated by particular socio-cultural realities for it to engender trust and take root in a locality. In the two places I do my research, namely Hadramaut, Yemen, and Java, Indonesia, no source perhaps expresses this imperative more than an anecdote from a 19th century Javanese court chronicle, the Babad Joko Tingkir. This chronicle charts the history of Islamic polities in Java, beginning with the establishment of the Sultanate of Demak in the late 15th century. The particular anecdote recounts the building of the Sultanate's congregational mosque, supervised by 9 saints believed to be among the earliest Muslim missionaries in Java. Completed in 1498, the Grand Mosque of Demak marked the crystallization of a new Islamic community. A mosque is, of course, a site of congregation, right? Of communal interaction, of knowledge transmission, and regimentation. While praying collectively, Muslims ought to stand behind a prayer leader and follow his lead. They are supposed to face one and only one direction, or Qibla, that of the Kaaba, the stone cube edifice at the center of the Grand Mosque of Mecca. Assembling a new regimented community, however, was apparently not that simple for the early Muslims of Java. The Demak Mosque, the chronicle describes, resisted the saints' attempt to orient its direction toward the Kaaba. The mosque nudged to right and left, swinging to and fro, never came to rest. One of the saints rose and performed a miraculous act, condensing the world to the extent that Mecca manifests before them. The saint grasps the Kaaba with his right hand and the peak of the Demak Mosque with his left, and turned both edifices to face one another. Alluding to the historical difficulty that marked Java's conversion to Islam, this anecdote portrays the tensions inherent in the labor of cultivating a community oriented toward a new religion, sacred space, and foundational past, all of which were foreign. Mitigating these tensions was the mission of saints and scholars who are portrayed as building religious infrastructures and laboring to create trust to overcome various local challenges to socially realize Islamic teachings. Interestingly, the anecdote describes how these actors were able to surmount the mosque's obduracy, not by forcing the mosque to orient itself toward the Kaaba, but by adjusting the position of both edifices, the Demak Mosque in Java and the Kaaba in Mecca, so that the two could form a perfect alignment. In this sense, the anecdote postulates a particular conception of religious authority and its relationship with social formation and the contingent production and reproduction of religious norms. It pushes us to think about labor and infrastructure that engender trust, enable transmission of ideas, and facilitate the emergence of a durable moral community. At the same time, it draws our attention to what I call articulatory labor that lurks behind a seemingly smooth transmission. By articulation, I mean an active process of aligning what is being transmitted to the particular assumptions and demands of its intended recipients. Just like the Demak Mosque demands that the Kaaba also be aligned with it and not just the mosque aligned to the Kaaba. In this sense, articulation involves transmission, but also modulation or recalibration of that which is being transmitted. Thinking about transmission of Islam as the outcome of articulatory labor accentuates the grounded and contingent work of Muslim scholars in winning the trust of the people and in modulating the normative teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, or Sunnah, in light of local cultural assumptions that in turn help their transmission and social realization. I begin with these two examples because they point to contending vision of what Islam and Islamic norm is, right? Between Al-Bakri as a history and the Babat Joko Tingkir. And so they point to contending vision of what Islam and Islamic norms is and how it ought to materialize in a given location. The two visions posit a contending conception of the Sunnah. Now, the term Sunnah is derived from the verb sanna, meaning to institute a practice that is emulated by others, thereby becoming an established norm that makes up a community's tradition. Today, most Muslims use the term Sunnah exclusively to refer to the deeds, utterances, and spoken approvals of the Prophet Muhammad. Muslims posit the prophetic Sunnah as the concrete elucidation of divine revelations enshrined in the Quran, from dress codes and performance of worship to rules for war. While the Quran does not contain most of the specific theological, legal, and ethical teachings that make up Islamic norms, it repeatedly commands Muslims to obey God and his prophet and pronounces Muhammad to be a most goodly example, uswatun hasana. In doing so, the Quran posits the prophet's life as the lens through which the holy book is interpreted and understood. Prophetic Sunnah, however, was never written down during the prophet's life. And textualization and compilation of reports that describe the Sunnah, known as hadiths, occurred over a period of decades and even centuries after the Prophet's death. And as such, they are not in themselves contemporary historical documentation of what Muhammad said and did. In the first two Islamic centuries, the Sunnah was in fact perceived as living, culturally embedded, and cumulative. The term referred to the exemplary practice instituted not only by the Prophet, but also by those connected to him, who were believed to know and embody his teachings, such as the Prophet's companions residing in different places. The sayings and practices of the Prophet were complemented by his successors, whose distinct experiences, characteristics, and memories of the Prophet blended with local cultures to form different regional sunnahs, like the Sunnah of Medina or the Sunnah of the garrison cities of Fustat and of Kufa and Basra and Kairawan. They each have their own Sunnah. Subsequent development of Islamic legal theory, however, led to the canonization of a methodological framework that delineates the prophetic past as objectified in the hadiths as the exclusive font of Sunnah. Objectification isolated the prophetic past as a clearly defined and uniquely normative category, rendering it into an unchanging and authoritative measuring stick that can circulate across distance and difference. Those skilled in authenticating and extrapolating the normative implications of hadiths, such as hadith verifiers and jurists, emerge as religious authorities. These actors have in turn continued to project the hadiths as the common and readily available transcripts of prophetic Sunnah imbued with scriptural standing and universal significance. As text, the Sunnah moves across contexts, allowing Muslims living in different times and places to imagine a shared and disembedded normativity independent of its particular context of production and realization. This notion of the objectified Sunnah, however, is just one among several conceptions of Sunnah operating among Muslims. We should not assume that there is a historic break that led to the transformation of the Sunnah from living to objectified norms, as many scholars have imagined. The older conception of the living Sunnah continues to exist, most notably among the Sufis or the mystics. For the Sufis, a Sufi master is an exemplar, a Qudwa. He is believed by his followers to be genealogically connected to the Prophet, has assimilated his characteristics, and actively transmits his teachings. As a result, his personality and conduct, as well as the practices he institutes, are considered as Sunnah and normative for his followers. Here, the recognition of the universal regulatory force of the Sunnah is not accompanied by a belief in the uniformity and finality of its content, which may be derived from prophetic precedents corroborated by hadiths, but may also include innovations tied to specific contexts and challenges, but nonetheless taken to essentially epitomize prophetic teachings through the figure of the Sufi master. Sociologically speaking, what turns a particular teaching and practice into Sunnah is its perceived connection in whatever shapes or forms to the prophetic past, together with its ability to become a precedent. Scholars who compile and disseminate hadiths can be said to institute Sunnah precisely because they do so not simply for antiquarian reasons, but to help facilitate their reenactment. Such works, however, are not sufficient to ensure the social realization of the hadiths as Sunnah. After all, authentic hadiths may be compiled in books that nobody reads, let alone acts upon. They may become objects of a scholastic enterprise with limited social consequences. Instituting Sunnah demands that the instituted practice is doable, recognizably connected to the prophetic past, even if its authenticity is uncertain, comprehensible to others through their particular cultural assumptions, and that it fulfills specific needs. Such a process diversifies and particularizes the Sunnah in relation to its new context of transmission and realization. Taking the ideological vision of the objectified Sunnah at face value, historians and anthropologists of Islam have too often fallen into the trap of presupposing the existence of a decontextualized, text-based global or scriptural Islam, which is usually posited in opposition to local Islams or local cultures. Let me illustrate this with several examples from history and anthropology of Islam to show how this assumption remains alive and continues to create methodological problem. Let me begin first with history. Historians of Islam have increasingly come to deploy terms like hybridity, translation, and transculturation to characterize the historical encounters between Muslims and other cultures or religious traditions. On the whole, these significant works, such as those that I list on the slide, demonstrate how culture and religion ought to be understood as composite products of historical interactions. A term like syncretism, in turn, is no longer deemed useful, considering that all pure cultures and religious traditions are outcomes of intercultural and intracultural transactions. In its own way, each of these works has highlighted the need for an analytic approach to Islam that can account for its contextually embedded reproduction. The challenge remains, however, in ensuring that such an approach does not succumb to or end up reproducing purportedly neutral dichotomies like global Islam versus local Islam, scriptural versus vernacular, and central versus peripheral. One should be careful of not positing the existence of a culturally purified or abstracted Islamic normativity that interacts with local cultures and religious traditions to produce more complex and culturally bound instantiations of Islam. The problem with notions of Islamization or indigenization of Islam is that they often assume local or regional Islam as the historical outcome of Islam plus Y, where Y points to the various local, cultural, and religious elements deemed to be different from Islam. To give one prominent example, the late historian of Java, Merle Ricklefs, who I had the pleasure of studying with in Singapore, describes the form of Islamic religiosity that historically developed in Java, particularly in the Kraton or the royal courts prior to the mid-19th century, as mystic synthesis. This, in his view, rested on three constitutive elements: a strong sense of Islamic identity, observation of the 5 pillars of Islamic ritual, and acceptance of the reality of local Javanese spiritual forces, such as Ratu Kidul, the goddess of the Southern Ocean, or the Sunan Lawu, the spirit of Mount Lawu, and other lesser supernatural beings. The notion of mystic synthesis, as Ricklefs defines it, denotes a unique combination of what some would describe as the more purified aspects of Islam and non-Islamic elements. For Ricklefs, mystic synthesis was a historical achievement that resulted from the maintenance of Javanese philosophy and the adoption of the outer symbols, rituals, and rather selectively, the law of Islam. On the one hand, Ricklefs' point of using the notion of mystic synthesis is to affirm a two-way negotiation between two entities, in contrast to the notion of syncretism, which involves value judgment in terms of what is authentic and what is derivative. Nevertheless, his use of such an agglomerative term, mystic synthesis, leaves the impression that Islam, as one of the two constituents of mystic synthesis, was already a prepackaged entity that could actually exist without the other. In other words, the basic assumption at work is that of Javanese importation and subsequent localization of Islam rather than autochthonous reproduction. It posits culture as extrinsic to, or as something that can be entered and exited, and not constitutive of Islam. But what is Islam in such a case? What are the Islamic ideals or elements of Islamic religious traditions or Islamic knowledge that are understood to have entered into creative transaction with local cultures or religious traditions? If one assumes the existence of a pre-cultural, pre-synthetic, pre-translation, pre-hybrid, or pre-transculturation Islam, who gets to decide what it is in the first place? To assume that local cultures were previously extrinsic to Islam and only gradually came to complicate the religion through historical transactions is, I think, to miss the culturally situated labor that aligns and modulates the prophetic past and the community, contingently determines the alignment between the two, and as a result produces Islam. Perhaps one could retain the term Islam to denote this particular Kraton-based religiosity as one among multiple instantiations of Islam that have developed historically in different parts of the Muslim world. This particular Kraton-centered Islam became increasingly seen as mystic synthesis, synthetic, or even problematic only because of the modern promotion and acceptance of a particular historically, geographically situated instantiations of Islam as normative, thereby measuring other instantiation on its terms. When one particular and often culturally purified and abstracted Islamic normativity is accepted, then other more complex and culturally bound instantiations of Islam are seen as Islam plus Y, where Y points to the various elements deemed to be different from Islam, such as Javanism, Hinduism, or local cultures. Such a perspective reproduced concepts like global Islam, local Islam, vernacular Islam that do not only serve dubious analytic work, but also performs ideological work of casting Islamic practices and perspectives produced outside the Middle East as being forever derivative on the one hand and encumbered with accretions from other cultures on the other. Now, let me turn to the anthropology of Islam to show how assumptions of a text-based global or scriptural Islam has also generated methodological problems. Indeed, anthropologists, I think more than historians, have tended to reproduce such an ideological product as an analytic category or explanatory paradigm, whether by asserting Islam as a blueprint in the case of Ernest Gellner, or as core symbols that shape and thus can explain social order in the case of Clifford Geertz, instead of recognizing it as a contingent product of ongoing social negotiations that needs to be explained. In response, Talal Asad has argued that Islam ought to be approached as a historically situated discursive tradition that includes and dynamically relates itself to the scriptures and to the changing forms of social practice, as opposed to a static blueprint or core symbols. Inspired by Asad, a generation of anthropologists of Islam have come to focus on how Muslims dynamically draw on scriptures and scripture-based textual traditions to inform social practices. Now, this development has been productive, bringing anthropology and its focus on social practice closer to Islamic studies and its focus on texts. Nevertheless, there are several problems with this approach. First, such an approach marginalized the different ways in which Muslims have related to Islam and Islamic norms beyond those provided by scripture or scripture-based textual traditions. The late Shahab Ahmed, for example, discusses the once widespread belief in the knowability of the unseen world posited to be the source of divine revelation, or what he calls the pretext of revelation. This, he suggested, allowed Muslims to produce a myriad of Islamic discourses and practices deemed to be authoritative beyond what is typically regarded as Islamic scripture or scripture-based prescriptive texts. These discourses and practices, however, have not been properly recognized as Islamic by scholars, owing to our limited scriptural assumption of what Islam is, or what Ahmed calls the text of the revelation. Secondly, Asad's notion of discursive tradition is ultimately founded on a linear account of transmission. Several anthropologists, including my own work on dreams, have highlighted the need to foreground the varieties of Muslims' temporal imagination, showing how everyday forms of religiosity are tied to different temporal registers, including imaginations of unstable and open pasts and futures. These interventions highlight the need to complicate the seemingly straightforward linearity of Islamic tradition and Muslim ethical becoming. This work suggests that anthropologists need to pay serious attention, not simply to the given history of Islamic practice or tradition, but also to the ways in which that history and its temporal architecture is imagined, authorized, represented, and lived. And there are major differences between different Muslim communities from another in this kind of temporal imagination. Third, and perhaps more importantly, this approach of focusing on how Muslims draw on textual traditions to inform social practices have inspired anthropologists of Islam to concentrate on authoritative practices, piety, and the embodiment of Islamic moral norms. Influenced by Asad and by extension late Foucault, works like those of Sabah Mahmoud and Charles Hirschkin argue that the constitution of an Islamic ethical subject is a process of subjectivation or self-cultivation involving reflective consciousness and freedom. That is, to consciously and actively make oneself a docile subject of a discourse, right? In doing so, they highlight a form of agency hitherto undervalued in anthropological literature that allow us to think about morality beyond the older model of blindly conforming to or resisting moral codes. This approach, however, have been criticized by other anthropologists for privileging coherent and programmatic modes of religion, rather than the contradictions, incoherencies, ambiguities, and moral pluralism of the everyday. For these scholars, the everyday acts as a site that allows for critical evaluation of and even creative resistance to religious norms. In my view, this divide fundamentally emerges from an assumption of a coherent, given, and prepackaged Islamic norms, which seems to be assumed and not questioned by both sides. And in my book, I problematize the juxtaposition and the opposition of normative moral and ethical codes on the one hand, and the everyday, by exploring the ways in which both are constituted by and constitutive of Islam. Understanding the social reality of the Sunnah as a contingent living norm allows us to question the contrast between allegedly hyper-coherent Islamic norms and the messiness of the everyday by observing the Sunnah as a site of instability that allows for creative explorations demanded by the everyday. This in turn allows us to see Islamic norms as contingent, that is, as embedded, immanent, continuously produced in, and modulated by cultural particularities and the vicissitudes of the everyday. In addressing the methodological problems in both history and anthropology that I have just sketched, my book proposes that historians and anthropologists studying Islam should depart not from the notion of scriptures or foundational texts, but from that of a vanished foundational past. So foundational past, right? Namely prophetic past, not foundational text. Temporal estrangement from the prophetic past necessitates the labor of connecting to, along with reconstructing and representing that past as a model or sunnah to others. Such labors involve authenticating transmitted reports and evaluating inherited practices, but it may also involve other forms of connections, such as those involving non-authentifiable dreams and visions. These labors are historically, geographically, and culturally situated. Concurrently, as an ideological and narrative product, time itself is constantly being made and remade, generating multiple constructions of time that add layers of complexity and diversity in how Muslims comprehend the prophetic past from a particular present and think about their relationship to it. The present on which these labors occur serves as the ground that modulates the past in the attempt to find not what is authentically Islamic, but rather what is essential to Islam for that very present and future. The concern with essence, as Assad reminds us, is not necessarily to be equated with a concern with authenticity. And what is essential in a religion, in turn, is not neutrally determinable because it is subject to agonistic and antagonistic arguments. The reconstructions and representations of the prophetic past by different actors may thus look dissimilar from one another. Such dynamics diversify and particularize the Sunnah. They generate a variety of Islamic texts, practices, and institutions that engender diverse forms of religious authority, from caliph and jurist to charismatic saint, holy warrior, and Sufi master, each claiming to connect Muslims to their foundational past. To be taken as authoritative, a connection to the prophetic past needs to be recognized by others. Authority, as Hannah Arendt explains, is a hierarchical relationship that connects a group of people with a past that they recognize to be foundational, thereby endowing those in authority with the capacity to transmit and transform that past into examples for the present. It is a relationship that is defined in contradistinction to coercion by force and persuasion through argument. Arendt arrives at this conclusion through an insightful observation of the Roman political tradition. The term authority, Arendt explains, comes from the Latin auctoritas, which is derived from the verb augere, meaning to augment. What is being augmented is a foundation built by others in the past and deemed to be sacred. For the Romans, that foundational past was the founding of the city of Rome. Those endowed with authority were the elders, the senate, or the patres, who had obtained it by descent and by transmission from those who had laid the foundation. Significantly, Arendt highlights that those in authority did not have power or potestas. Instead, their task was solely to augment the foundation and transform it into an example or model for present action by imparting advice and effecting obedience without coercion. Resorting to power in articulating such a model, in turn, signals the failure of authority. While Arendt's account may be historically specific and relies on a rather restricted conception of power compared with what we are now accustomed to after Foucault, it nevertheless can help us develop an alternative framework to comprehend Islamic religious authority, one that highlights the peculiarity of authority as a relationship distinct from other forms of power relation. Her observation accentuates how authority rests neither on common reason nor on the power of the one who commands, but on the recognition of the hierarchy deemed by all parties involved to be right and legitimate. Trust, I think, is very central to this dynamic. In fact, the formation of religious authority can be thought of as fundamentally a labor of building trust. Building trust is what allowed the Prophet to cultivate a community based on unverifiable revelation. Building trust, as I show in the book, is also the central dynamic that allowed Ba'alawi scholars, preachers, and Sufi masters to assemble their community and become recognized as actors who are connected to the prophetic past and are able to transform that past into normative example for the present. But building trust is a laborious process that unfortunately is often taken for granted in many works on religious authority, particularly those that rely on the Weberian notion of charisma, right? Building trust involves actively living with people, showcasing generosity, extending hospitality, building infrastructure, organizing meetings, traveling to meet people, mediating disputes, narrating and connecting different histories, acquiring different genealogies of knowledge transmission, and so on. It involves helping individuals to practice their religion amidst the complexity and contingency of life, which demands some degree of practical wisdom that can effectively mediate prescription and practice. Muslim scholars had to master not only Islamic knowledge, but also other ideological systems operating in their localities, from astronomy and astrology, spirit possession and exorcism, to local customs, ethnomedicine, tribal genealogies, water dowsing in the desert, and even developing nose for ore and taming or trapping elephants in the Malayan jungle, as Terence Sevea's excellent recent book has shown. Oftentimes, religious norms transmitted by a scholar is rejected by his prospective followers on account of it being too distinct from their custom. Indeed, unfamiliarity with local knowledge or failure as rainmaker can very well lead to the failure of a scholar to gain recognition and trust, which in turn limits his ability to transmit and socially realize Islamic norms. In short, the formation of religious authority requires ongoing labors of producing and reproducing, as well as maintaining interpersonal relationship. A relationship is an achievement, an outcome of contingent and precarious labor of gaining trust, and not a given. A relationship can fail, and they do indeed fail. It needs constant labor, and this labor cannot stop if the relationship is to endure and develop into a durable community. Even durability, I think, is something that points to the constant reproduction, right? Something that is durable is something that is constantly reproduced. It's not something static in a way. Produced in and through such relationships, the Sunnah becomes a living, socially embedded and cumulative model that guides and is simultaneously guided by the world, involving more than a simple attempt at replicating the foundation or applying an objectified sunnah to new domains. Transmission entailed acts of curation, description, exploration, and innovation, all of which augment the foundation. As living norms, the sunnah has the capacity to accommodate and adapt to cultural particularities, individual needs, and the vicissitudes of everyday life. Far from being simply a set of common, consistent, and disembedded norms posited to be globally applicable, the sunnah may outwardly express itself equally well through differences and even opposites, thereby contributing to the crystallization of a variety of different ways of life and rendering moral discourse as open-ended and unfinished. The fact that the prophetic past as the foundation upon which the sunnah rests is not objectively available means that the sunnah becomes available only through contextually specific retrospective attempts of connecting to, capturing, describing, embodying, and transforming that past into a practicable model for the present. These attempts generate a plethora of particular contents that do not simply exemplify the sunnah, but struggle with it and give specific shape and form to it. Let me end by reiterating that ultimately, the notion of a global or universal norm that we can call Islamic, that I think is somehow inbuilt in our conception of world religion, which is posited to be different from cultural particularities, is simply an ideological vision. And as an ideological construct, they can be analytically misleading. Sociologically speaking, the sunnah is, and by default, a living phenomenon. One may say that this ideological vision has been continuously produced. One may say that this ideological vision, right, has been continuously produced over the course of history due to precisely the sheer plurality of contending Islamic norms. Hence, the ongoing attempts by actors, not just modernists like al-Bakri, but others who came before and after him to reform and purify Islam. Any attempt to purify the sunnah from cultural accretions, however, can never be completely successful. And this inability is inherent in the very materiality of semiotic form employed to undertake a project of purification. Like any doctrine or ideology, prophetic teachings cannot exist socially or be transmitted without some semiotic embodiment, which necessarily imposes certain conditions on them, such as iterability, contingencies of form, and the hazards inherent in the processes of decontextualization and recontextualization. Notwithstanding its universalist aspiration, visions of an objectified sunnah depends on the particularities of semiotic forms like texts, whose efficacy hinges on their portability, and capacity to be recontextualized elsewhere. Recontextualization, however, generates new kinds of interactions, interpersonal relations, hierarchies, and infrastructures that culturally entangle those normative teachings and can themselves become objects of fetishism, thereby undermining purification. The question of who transmit this text and to whom they are communicated is also significant, as human actors are not abstract individuals. The people who make up an Islamic community come with their own historical and cultural particularities, which in turn may shape the way the textually mediated sunnah is understood, transmitted, and socially realized. While inherent, the risks of cultural entanglement or fetishism that come with any project of purification are troubling only when viewed within the values and ideologies of particular theologies or semiotic ideologies that assume the possibility of separating religion from culture, or deem the cultural embeddedness of religious norms to be a problem. While as historians or anthropologists, we may not necessarily subscribe to such a theology or semiotic ideology, it is often the case that our assumption about what is Islam or Islamic norms is informed by similar assumption, thereby producing binaries that I have discussed in this talk, from scriptural and vernacular, global and local, central and peripheral, to moral norms and discourse and the everyday, all of which seem to assume to different degrees the givenness of Islam. What I have hoped to do in my book is precisely to situate Islam as a sociological product. Instead of positing it as a given and presuming it as an explanatory paradigm, I suggest that we situate Islam as a contingent achievement that needs to be explained. So not an explanatory paradigm, but as something that needs to be explained. Central to that achievement is the role of actors who became authoritative owing to their ongoing labor of building trust. And I'll stop there.